Good morning. Welcome to LinkedIn Live, the podcast Life Expansion After 50. Today's episode is all about the unseen power of words. I'll be taking a practical look at how words influence our lives, probably more than you realize, and how they connect to something even deeper. Now, your words are downstream from the source. They're downstream from your thoughts. They're downstream from other influences and intentions. And I want to show you what that means. I first became aware of this power while I was selling motivational materials as a side business during my time in the Army. I was a distributor for Success Motivation Institute, and I sold a set of books and tapes that I used to facilitate and guide people through a 16-week program to help them set and achieve their goals. Now, the presentation for selling the program was very specific. We were instructed to follow it verbatim, and it worked. I had a solid 30% closing ratio. But what really caught my attention was this. Many of the people who seemed most excited about the program and really engaged and wanted it, but for whatever reason couldn't take action, I wasn't able to close them at the time. They never made a purchase. In fact, outside of the structured presentation where I was able to go from beginning to end, I couldn't close a single sale. And today, I'll tell you where that influenced me. When I'm working with salespeople or somebody who's working on their sales process, I use gating. And I say, don't go into the presentation until you know that they are ready to also take action. Because presentations, they are a series of priming, and they tap into cognitive biases, and they're literally building a story inside the person's mind or brain that leads them, if it's the right match, of course, to make the sale. But I had zero. Now, normally when you have callbacks or B-backs, whatever, I would say 20% closing ratio, 20 to 40% is probably around normal. But I had zero. No one ever bought outside of that presentation. And that stuck with me. Now, if you ever been to a timeshare sales presentation or something like that, you may have noticed certain unusual techniques being used, techniques that you probably never experienced anywhere else in your life, but that timeshare presentation. These techniques are intentional. They're designed to make people say yes when they work. Now, I have to say this, I'm not for that. And I subscribe to the point of view that Robert Cialdini uses, that we're not supposed to introduce this stuff. It's good when there's a good match and you're helping a person overcome their own inhibitions to make the purchase. But to sell stuff that people don't need, I am 100% against that. So as I said, these techniques are intentional. They're designed to get people to say yes. I don't want to say make. They're designed to get people to say yes. Now, it's unlikely there are many sales outside of timeshare presentations similar to my experience. Now, fast forward to 15 years. I was conducting a sales and prospecting course. We would teach the agents from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., then hit the phones to set up appointments for that same evening. Make the appointment, they'd go get something to eat, and then they would go on the appointment. Now, we were booking life insurance appointments, and we were getting an amazing 50% contact to appointment ratio. Think about that. Typically, 20% is a good number. But 50%, and that was consistent, and that accounted for the people who were having trouble, right? So many people were getting 100% appointments that same night, and it was all about the script. Now, granted, we were calling the agents existing home and auto clients, but still 50% is a great number, as I said, compared to a more typical 20%. And we were securing those appointments for the same evening, usually 3 to 4 hours later. I taught that course for several months to train the agents in the territory. I had to get all the agents through, and we held at a steady 50%. But this isn't about getting appointments. What I observed during those call sessions was eye-opening. I'd walk around during the calling time, help out with calls or whatever, and I'd listen to the agents. And almost every time someone who was struggling to make appointments, it was because they had rearranged just 5 words in the script, same exact words, but they changed the sequence of them, put them in a different order. And it was enough to turn a yes into a no. and they just couldn't get past it. And I would go in and I'd make that switch, do it this way, I'd have them practice 2 or 3 times. They would make the call and they would get the appointment. Now, I will tell you, they didn't like it. It was uncomfortable. The way that question was posed was uncomfortable, but it got sales. And I think that's one of the challenges is we have to deal with as salespeople and business people. Sometimes what gets us the results is not real comfortable, and we have to decide which one we're going to take. And it is a conscious choice. Anyway, as I said, there are other people hitting 100% because we had agents who weren't getting anything initially. I got them; they all figured it out and got the appointments. But there were others hitting 100%. That's how that 50% closing ratio stayed so high for appointments. And then we would go on appointments, and we had a good sales rate as well. We had a good closing rate, better than average closing rate making the sales. But the big point was around the appointments because we didn't really change much in how they do the presentation. Now, this phenomenon relates to Robert Cialdini, the author of Influence and the book Persuasion. It's PRE, Persuasion. He calls it the click-whir response. It's like a metaphor for a mechanical automatic reaction, like turning on a computer and you get that click whir thing going. And that's what he called it. He says, like, when you say the right thing in the right way, it flips a switch in the listener's mind. I first heard Cialdini speak in the early 90s, and he talked a lot about something he called the because frame. Now, at that time, it was one of the 7 key factors, at least in his presentation. And I later noticed it has been reduced to just the 6 factors of influence. The because frame is not talked about as much anymore. The 6 factors that stayed are reciprocity, rapport, authority, scarcity, commitment/consistency, and social proof. I think that because frame didn't really fit as neatly into that group as the others are more cognitive bias type. Now, I had learned about the because frame a couple of years before teaching that sales class I was talking about. So I was already primed to notice how specific words and their order can make all the difference. Without that awareness, I might have completely missed it because the questions sounded so similar. Let me take you quickly through that because frame, because I think it's an eye opener. If you haven't heard it before, if you have, it's quick. So the setup is, how they do double blind research, and the people who are doing their research, a lot of times they think they're looking at something else or checking something else, but then they are involved in the actual research as well. So anyway, they would have a line at the copier, and they could create this line because they were controlling some of those variables. But these people were just random, right? Or at least anyway, the person would walk up and say, I have 5 pages. May I use the copier? Because I'm in a rush. And the person would get something like 94% of the people would let them in front of them. Then they had the person, again, double blind, so they have to mix it up and all that. They had the person say, I have 5 pages. May I use the copier? I'm in a rush. And it dropped to 60%. What was different? The word because was not there. So they went further and they said, I have 5 pages. May I use the copier? Because I have to make some copies. And it went to 93%. So what I'm saying is, and when he talked, he used the example of I'm double parked, as opposed to just I'm in a rush. And they tried other things as well. But here's the thing. The word because, when there was a reason like I'm in a rush or double parked, was 94%. When they took out that reason and just plugged in, I have to make some copies, it went back up to 93%. So that you can't look at that if you're in sales and marketing and ignore it, because it's telling you there's something going on there and I need to understand it. That led to a deep dive for me in cognitive biases. Now, at the time, I knew about the 6th, as I mentioned already, and then confirmation bias came into my attention, and other things I noticed, like when I was working on incentive compensation for salespeople, I noticed that there was always this element of gaming the system. And I used to try to work that out of it and somebody share with me, you can't. You just have to accept it. It's people are going to game the system. And if you try to squeeze that gaming out, you create cognitive dissonance. There's that word again. So what's going on here? You create cognitive dissonance, and then they get confused and the incentive doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So you just have to accept that people are going to game the system. I thought that was interesting. Now, this all comes under that umbrella of 95% of our lives are run by habit. And most people would agree with that. 95% of our lives are run by habit. And I'm not so much against the fact that 95% of my life is by habit. I prefer more like 85%. But what I want is the automaticity to be working towards my vision, goals, and my purpose, not where it seems to be working against me. So that's a very, very important point. The way we're wired, the fact that the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second versus the conscious mind's 50 bits per second, the way the reticular activating system works, the reaction time of the subconscious is faster than the conscious. So the conscious is just outgunned. And so I think we're always going to be running by some large percentage by habit. The point is we can get the automaticity working for us instead of against us. So before I get into that further, I want to talk about this thing on words. Now, I first came across the 7% of communication is words, 38% is nonverbals, and 55% is physiology. I came across that around 1990 when I was going deep in neuro-linguistic programming. And I would say since around the mid-90s, every sales book I opened had some reference to that 738-55. However, when I'm in a sales conversation, I'm doing fact finding, or when I'm in a leadership conversation and I'm understanding what's going on in somebody's head, I am treating words 60, 80, 100%. Why? From experience. If I'm in a sales fact finding presentation and their guard is down and I'm getting deep answers or answers to my deep questions, that's golden. And I take those notes, and those are the same points I use in the close. If there's an objection, I'm using it there because that's what they really mean. So if that's what they really mean, and I say they being the person, who or what is the entity that's only 7% words? Because on the other hand, there are situations where I will discount what I'm hearing and go with what I'm seeing, the physiology and the hearing, right? The nonverbals, tone, timbre, pace, things like that. Where I'm going with this is that we have to take another look at words, and they have a lot of power. As I've already given the example of the presentations, and I would say, just to kind of put a bow on that, I would say that deep conscious thinking is the difference between words that are like 70 to 100% versus words that are only 7%. When you're deep conscious thinking, like a mindfulness response is going to be much higher. And I'll just give you an example. One of the things I've done as a leader is when I get a new employee or new direct report, I would ask questions to uncover their purpose. And it didn't change. I've asked probably over 100 people about their purpose. I have a series of questions that I ask. They don't change. So if they're that consistent, and it's the same thing in a sales presentation. If I'm talking to a person, I'm doing fact finding, those hot buttons that I uncover when I'm paying attention to what words they're saying to my very specific questions, they don't change. So that is not 7%. So we have to cut the deck there and figure that out. But again, I would say it's a mindfulness response. It's going to be much higher. Words are going to be much more important. And then you could always use the physiology to check. Now, the reason I'm talking about words here is I'm going to ask you to do a self-talk audit. And we're going to pick up on this next week when we come back. Same time next week, 7 o'clock Pacific time. And we're going to take one of your self-talk elements that you feel might be keeping you from going after it. Now, I'm not saying self-sabotage. I'm not saying it's stopping you. I'm saying it's the thing that exists that keeps you from going after it. Maybe you were offered a promotion and you didn't take it and you came up with some reason, but really what's deep down inside is this belief or this position or this story. So we're going to go into that. So when you do your self-talk, there's three categories. There's your self-talk that's aligned with your vision, goals, dreams, and what you want, the life design. There are those words and phrases that are not aligned. And then there's the neutral ones. And I would just put them in those three categories and then find one. And this is not mental health. This is not, I don't want to go down that path, but I want you to find one that's been persistent long enough. And we're talking, motherhood and apple pie level stuff, not existential, right? Something that's keeping you from going after it. Is this anxiety that you feel like if you do X, Y, and Z, bad things are going to happen. This is that belief or feeling that these things that you really want are not available to you, and it's just because who you are. Something like that. I want you to come up with that belief. And then we'll spend some time with it next week when I come back. Now, I want you to, as you think about those words, if I make the statement that if you tell me that your purpose is to do ABC, I'm taking that as face value. I've already told you, if it's a deep conversation, there's mindfulness there, I'm going to take that as 80, 70, 80, 100%, meaning, that's really what you mean. And I'm going to take that to the bank. Then who's the other entity that's coming up with this self-talk? Or what is the other entity that's coming up with the self-talk? I want you to think about that too. And as you come up with that belief, those words that you're using, I want you to just think about where they came from. But we're going to actually do more of a deep dive and go through it next week. Now, here's what I want to set the stage for that. Let me go to my pad here. I want to do an illustration. So you've heard of stimulus response, right? So we have stimulus and we have response. And in automatic habits, James Clear refers to it as the cue. Same thing. And the stimulus happens and then we get the response. And this timing is somewhere between 150 milliseconds to about 750 milliseconds. So in other words, about a little over 1/10 of a second to maybe 3/4 of a second. And it's on the higher end when you're distracted. It's on the lower end when either you are like training for reaction time or you've run a pattern so often that they get bundled. It's called a meta program. But when associations get bundled, you end up with that 150, closer to that 150. And that's why, think about myelin. If you read The Talent Code or Grit by Angela Duckworth, Talent Codes by Dan Coyle, you talk about myelin, rapping with myelin. You get more myelin rapping when you're struggling on the edge of ability. That's deep practice. And that myelin rapping enables neural pathways to fire faster with more precision, more accuracy, faster and quicker. So in other words, they start more quickly and they fire faster. When you're talking about 150 milliseconds, that's pretty darn fast as it is. To put it in perspective, cats have a reaction time of about 80 milliseconds. Normal human stuff is more like like a quarter of a second, 250 milliseconds. 150 is more like down in the with dogs. And that's, again, athletes and people who train for reaction time. So this stimulus response, the way I look at it, is a big part of the problem, because this is the habit: stimulus and then the response. And some of us have been running the same stimulus response habit pattern for years. This thing is life expansion after 50. So in order to make the second half of our adult life the best half, we're going to have to break the habit of being our old self. And in order to break the habit of being our old self, we have to deal with this habit thing. Now, this is not the whole story. And most people, when they try to go after habits, they start here and they make very little progress, which is why we've turned our lives over to that other quote unquote entity. And we're running our lives 95% by habit. Now, some of those habits are good, flossing and brushing your teeth, making up your bed. Those are great habits to have. But there are other habits and habits of thought that cause you to pull back or that cause you to get tense, have anxiety in the unfamiliar. There are some habits that you don't even think of as habits. You just think of it as anxiety, but you may not think of it as a habit of thought. It's a habit pattern. And you can change that habit pattern the same way a person can change the habit pattern and not say ums and have filler words. The same way a person can change the habit pattern to not speak right away after a question, but to pause. These are habit patterns that we can build in just like you can with anxiety. Again, I'm not talking about mental health. So this thing, as I said, it starts way upstream. It starts with, over here you have priming, and you have cognitive biases, and you have stories. And these two can interact with each other. They can affect each other. That's why I stacked them. Because you can have more stories, you can have more cognitive biases in different situations, could bring in other different things. And then you have the actual stimulus. But that's not all. You also have, see, I don't call it stimulus response. I call it stimulus reaction response. Now, it doesn't flow as nicely as stimulus response, but that's what's actually happening. There's a stimulus, then there's a reaction. That's that initial gut feeling. And too many people let their reaction equal their response. And that's a problem. If you ever seen somebody just like jump up and do something that just didn't make sense, you know, I've seen people just get up and leave the room. Heard about a guy, he was in a conference meeting and he got triggered and he just got up and quit. He literally quit right then and there. No plan, wasn't planning it. It just triggered him so badly. So that's one of those reaction equals the response. So there's actually another box in here called choice. So when people say you can make a choice, that's true. But if you don't deal with it out here, it's real hard to make a choice in here because you're going to have stimulus, reaction, choice, response. So this to me is the one that's not so much in our control. The other thing that happens is between stimulus and response, and actually we have the cognitive biases. I actually drew this wrong. What I meant to call this was beliefs. So we have beliefs and stories, and then we have the stimulus, the cognitive bias comes into play. We have reaction, choice, and then response. So this gets to be automatic, but you can actually train that too. We can actually train that to be more aligned with your vision. And then once you get this more aligned with your vision, you have as much time as you need to make a choice, but you only need a quarter of a second. Why? Because the subconscious has call it a quarter of a second reaction time. And then the conscious mind has a half a second reaction time. So in a quarter of a second, the conscious mind kicks in. But the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second. So it's already has a running start. And by doing this right, your choice, you can literally engage the reticular activating system, which is basically the filter. That's why when you decide that you're going to buy a silver car, all of a sudden you see silver cars all over the place. That's one of the reasons why goal setting works. When you set the goal, it seems like all this serendipity happens. It's not that you're manifesting it with the goal. It was always there, but your reticular activating system is making that, bringing attention to it. That's why headlines work, at least in part. Somebody has a goal, they want something. If you've ever noticed, you see those headlines were always there or something similar, but because you're interested in this one thing, the headline gets you. That's why some people, they focus on the headline and the subheadline, and and they forget to have a really good product behind it. And so people are buying stuff because it works. The ad copy works, but it may not be the right thing for them. So, again, let's do this the right way. So anyway, you got priming, you have beliefs, you have stories, then you have stimulus, response. There's a cognitive bias impact right there. And then you have choice, and then you have your response. And the response is going to be things like you can decide, you can speak, you can withdraw, you can delay, you can skip it, you can fight or flight, which is not a good one, and you can freeze or faint. What we want to do is make a choice as to what we're going to do here. And again, you only need a quarter to a half a second to figure that out, because one of your options is always going to be delay. So if you're not sure if it's a yes, then you make it a delay or a no. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. Because unless you're going after a specific goal and it's going to impact you. But if this is a stimulus that just randomly showed up, why just have an automatic reaction? Because if somebody can control, if you have your reaction equal your response, then a person can control your behavior and your outcomes and where you end up by controlling your reaction. If you let your reaction equal your response, then a person can control you by creating a stimulus to control that gets your reaction. So we don't want that. We want to make sure that we have a choice spot in there. And as far as the cognitive biases, I went down a deep dive into thinking I was going to help people overcome cognitive biases, but I actually solved it with this process. So we'll talk about it a little bit next week. But essentially, rather than trying to figure out all the cognitive biases and how they're affecting me, what we're going to do is just take them out of play. All right. So that is it for now. Remember, do an audit of your self-talk. Find some self-talk that's not aligned. Find the self-talk that is aligned with your vision, goals, purpose, dreams, design, your life design, and then the neutral ones. And we want to find one that's not aligned and has been responsible for holding you back. So we'll talk about that next week, same time. I'll pick up here and I'll review this, and then we'll talk about what you can do. So it's not just saying this is what's going on. We're going to have ways that you can actually deal with things along the way. But I want you to be working on something real, which is why I'm having you do the belief. Okay? We'll talk to you next week.